My sister hijacked my engagement dinner to announce her pregnancy, and my family took her side. Now I'm rebuilding my life and setting boundaries for the first time. I'm a 29-year-old guy, engaged to my wonderful fiancée, a woman I've been with for 6 years. She's 30 and we've spent the last year planning our wedding. It's the kind of thing you dream about, finding the person you want to spend your life with and celebrating that love with everyone you care about. Both of our families are close knit, so we were looking forward to a big celebration that would bring everyone together. At least that was the plan. The engagement itself was perfect. I proposed during a vacation we took earlier this year at a quiet, scenic spot by the ocean. She said yes, and we were over the moon. Her family was ecstatic when they found out, showering us with congratulations and love. My parents were thrilled too. My mom immediately started brainstorming ideas for an engagement dinner, and my dad was already asking when we'd set a date. I thought my sister, who's 27, would be just as happy for us. I was wrong. A little backstory about my sister. She's always been the star of the family. She went to a prestigious college, landed a high-paying job, and generally got praised for everything she did. Meanwhile, I was just the steady, reliable one. It's not like I resent her for it. That's just the way it's always been. She's also the type of person who needs to be at the center of attention, so I had this tiny voice in the back of my head, wondering if she'd be okay with me having my moment. Still, I wanted to believe this dinner would go smoothly. My parents invited our extended family to their house for the occasion, and my fiancé and I were excited to share our news. It felt like the perfect opportunity to announce our engagement and kick off the celebrations. When we arrived at my parents' place, everything seemed normal. My mom was busy setting the table, my dad was grilling in the backyard, and family members were trickling in. My sister showed up with her husband about 20 minutes after us, carrying a tray of dessert. She was all smiles, greeting everyone warmly. There was nothing unusual at first, just your typical family gathering with lots of laughter and small talk. For about an hour in, everyone sat down for dinner. My mom gave a little toast, welcoming everyone and saying how happy she was to have the family together. I was waiting for the right moment to stand up and announce the engagement, and my fiancé gave me a little nudge to let me know she was ready too. But before I could say a word, my sister suddenly cleared her throat and said she had some exciting news to share. Everyone turned to her, and she smiled and announced she was pregnant. The room went quiet for a few seconds, and then the cheers started. My parents jumped up to hug her, my mom teared up, and everyone at the table started congratulating her and asking questions. It was like someone flipped a switch and all the attention shifted to her. My fiancé and I sat there, caught completely off guard. I tried to stay composed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she had timed her announcement on purpose. It was obvious she knew what the dinner was for. My parents had told everyone we were planning to share big news, and yet here she was, dropping her bombshell right before I had a chance to say anything. The rest of the night was a blur. My sister started showing off ultrasound pictures she'd conveniently brought along and talking about her due date. People were asking her about baby names, nursery plans, and how she was feeling. My mom kept calling her the first one to give us a grandbaby like it was the greatest achievement in the world. Meanwhile, my fiancé and I sat there, trying to smile and act like we weren't being completely overshadowed. At one point, my dad tried to bring the conversation back to us, asking if we had anything to share. But by then, it felt pointless. The moment was gone, and I didn't want to force an announcement when no one seemed particularly interested. My fiancé gave me a supportive squeeze under the table, but I could tell she was just as frustrated as I was. After dinner, my sister kept holding court in the living room, soaking up all the attention. My parents couldn't stop gushing over her, and the rest of the family followed suit. My fiancé and I ended up leaving early. On the way home, we talked about what had happened. She said she was happy for my sister, but couldn't believe how the focus had shifted so completely. She felt like the timing of the announcement wasn't a coincidence, and honestly, I couldn't disagree. Over the next few days, I tried to process everything. Part of me wanted to believe my sister didn't mean to overshadow us, but the other part couldn't ignore how convenient it all seemed. I talked to a few close friends about it, and they were all on my side, saying it was unfair and out of line. My fiancé encouraged me to confront my sister, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up without making things worse. That's when I decided to share my story here. I'm torn between feeling justified in my frustration and wondering if I'm overreacting. Was it just bad timing, or did my sister deliberately steal the spotlight? I'd love to hear your thoughts. After the dinner, I pulled back from my family for a few days. I didn't ignore them completely, but I avoided long conversations and didn't initiate any calls. The whole situation left me uncomfortable, and every time I replayed the night in my head, I felt worse. My fiancé kept encouraging me to address it, but I wasn't sure where to start without causing more drama. 3 days after the dinner, my sister texted me. She suggested we meet up and talk, and while I hesitated, I agreed. She proposed meeting at our parents' house, which felt like neutral ground, so I went along with it. When we sat down to talk, she acted casual, like nothing unusual had happened. I started by bringing up the dinner and how her announcement had completely overshadowed my engagement. She tilted her head, looking surprised, and insisted she hadn't done it on purpose. She claimed she'd only announced the pregnancy because she was excited and couldn't wait any longer to tell everyone. I reminded her that the dinner was specifically meant to share my engagement news. She shrugged it off, saying that family news was family news and it wasn't like one event was more important than the other. My fiancé, who had joined me for the talk, chimed in, trying to explain how hurt she felt by how the night had played out. My sister brushed it off, saying that pregnancies are naturally exciting and she didn't understand why we were making a big deal about it. The conversation spiraled from there. I pointed out that she could have chosen another time to announce her news instead of hijacking a moment that was meant to celebrate my engagement. She kept repeating that it wasn't intentional and suggested I was overthinking it. She even laughed at one point, calling me too sensitive. Then my parents stepped in. They'd been hovering in the background, and it wasn't long before they jumped into the conversation. They said both the engagement and the pregnancy were big milestones and that we should all be happy for one another. To them, the night was a celebration of family, not about who got the most attention. It felt like they were completely ignoring how deliberate my sister's timing had been. I tried to explain my perspective again, but it was clear they weren't interested in taking sides. My mom said we should focus on the positives and not let small things create tension. My dad nodded in agreement, and it felt like the whole thing was being swept under the rug. After leaving the house, I called a couple of my friends to vent. They were shocked when I told them what had happened and couldn't believe my sister hadn't even apologized. One of them said it sounded like she had a habit of pulling focus, and they didn't understand why my parents were enabling it. The more I thought about it, the more patterns started to emerge. My sister had always been the one to dominate conversations at family gatherings, constantly sharing updates about her job, her house, or her travels. It was like she couldn't stand not being the center of attention, and my parents never seemed to notice. They praised her for everything, while my milestones often felt like afterthoughts. I started questioning whether this jealousy had been building for years. Maybe I just never noticed because I wasn't competing with her. But now that I had something big to celebrate, it felt like she couldn't handle it. A few days later, I decided to confront her again. This time I was more direct. I told her that her timing was unfair and that her actions came across as selfish. She responded with the same defensiveness, saying I was blowing things out of proportion and accusing me of not being happy for her. She even threw in a comment about how I'd always had things go my way, as if my engagement was just another example of me getting special treatment. I walked away from that conversation even more frustrated. It seemed like no matter what I said, she was going to twist it around and make herself the victim. My fiancé, meanwhile, was starting to feel alienated. She told me she didn't understand why my family couldn't fully support our engagement without turning it into a competition. The tension started bleeding into my relationship. We were supposed to be planning the happiest time of our lives, but instead, we were dealing with family drama. My fiancé felt like my parents didn't care about her role in the family, and it was hard to argue when they kept prioritizing my sister's news over ours. I realized something had to change. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like I was being expected to take a back seat in my own life to accommodate my sister's need for attention. I called my best friend to ask for advice, and she suggested setting boundaries. She said if my sister or parents couldn't respect my feelings, it might be time to pull back for a while. By the end of the week, I made a decision. I needed to address this directly with my parents and figure out if they were willing to support me or if they were too wrapped up in my sister's drama. If they couldn't acknowledge the problem, I'd have to set some clear boundaries for my own sanity. I wasn't sure how the next conversation would go, but I knew I couldn't keep letting things slide. A week later, I sat down with my parents to talk things through. We met at their house and I started by explaining how my sister's timing at the dinner had overshadowed my engagement and how sidelined I felt. My dad leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, while my mom sat with her hands folded on the table, nodding slightly as I spoke. When I finished, my dad said that I should focus on being happy for my sister. My mom chimed in saying my sister was going through a big life change and needed support. It felt like they weren't even considering my side. They kept steering the conversation back to her pregnancy, saying things like, "A baby changes everything, and this is her first time being in the spotlight as a mom." I tried to keep the conversation on track, telling them I was happy for her, but that it wasn't fair for my engagement to be pushed aside. My mom gave a small smile and said the family could celebrate both milestones, but it was clear they'd already decided which one mattered more. Later that day, I bumped into my sister outside. She must have overheard part of the conversation because she started talking about how everyone has their time and this was hers. She mentioned I was already married in all but name, whereas she was just starting her family, like that somehow justified everything. Before I could say much, she walked off, leaving me standing there. That talk with my parents left me questioning a lot. It wasn't just about the dinner anymore. It was about years of feeling like my accomplishments were less important. My fiancée wasn't surprised when I told her how it went, but she was clearly hurt. She said it felt like my family would always prioritize my sister over us. That led to a tense conversation between us about how involved my family should be in the wedding at all. Meanwhile, my sister wasn't backing down. A couple of days after our talk, she started posting pregnancy updates on social media. She shared an ultrasound picture with a caption like, "Our little miracle," and another post about how she was so grateful to be the first grandchild's mom. It wasn't subtle, and it felt like every post was aimed at making her pregnancy the center of attention. I told a few friends about what was happening. One of them said my sister's behavior sounded toxic and that she always seemed to need the spotlight. They couldn't believe my parents didn't see it. Another friend suggested I limit contact with her for my own peace of mind, which sounded more and more appealing. Around this time, my fiancée suggested we step back from family gatherings for a while. She said it wasn't worth the frustration, especially when we were supposed to be planning our wedding. I agreed, and we started skipping casual family dinners and meetups. My sister seemed to notice. She stopped replying to my messages and didn't pick up when I called. When she did speak to me, it was always brief, and she managed to slip in a passive-aggressive comment about how little I'd been around. Once, she joked that maybe I was jealous of her pregnancy, which caught me so off guard I didn't even know how to respond. The next family gathering we attended was awkward from the start. My mom kept glancing at me and my fiancé, but no one brought up the engagement or the wedding plans. My sister, of course, had plenty to share about her pregnancy, everything from nursery themes to her latest doctor's appointment. By the time we left, I was more convinced than ever that my family didn't really care about our big day. I started thinking about boundaries. Up until now, I'd been trying to smooth things over and keep the peace, but it was starting to feel like I was the only one making an effort. Maybe it was time to stop bending over backward to accommodate everyone else. One night, I sat down with my fiancé and talked through what setting boundaries would look like. We agreed that we'd stop updating my family on wedding plans until they showed genuine interest. We'd also scale back on visits to avoid more unnecessary drama. I considered having another heart-to-heart with my sister, but I couldn't decide if it was worth it. Every time we talked, it felt like I was hitting a wall. She'd deflect, play the victim, or twist things around to make it seem like I was the one causing problems. To clear my head, I turned to Reddit. I shared an update explaining everything that had happened since the dinner and asking for advice. The responses came flooding in. A lot of people said my sister's behavior sounded calculated and that my parents were enabling her. Others suggested going low contact until they started respecting my boundaries. Reading those comments helped me feel less alone, but it also made me realize how deep the rift had become. It wasn't just about the engagement anymore. It was about years of feeling overlooked and underappreciated. I didn't know how to fix it, but I knew one thing. Something had to change.